Hello, everyone. Sean here from Mythos and Logos, joined by Matt from 60 Second Philosophy, where today we
Hello.
are taking a look at a Platonic dialogue, the Gorgias. I myself, having a background in myth, was very fascinated by especially the ending of this one, but to follow some of the points that Socrates and these rhetoricians that he was speaking with um, reached throughout the main bulk of this dialogue. That is why we are turning to the expertise of Matt. He is a fantastic, very insightful YouTube philosopher and is going to give us a great time. So it seems like the conversation here is about teaching, seems to be at the core of it. And what exactly is Socrates getting at, and who are these people that he's speaking with?
So there's a lot of there are a couple of the Platonic dialogues revolve around rhetoricians and rhetoric. And rhetoric kind of growing up alongside the early bits of philosophy in around the time that Socrates was doing his work. In fact, Socrates got sort of accused of being a rhetorician himself in the Clouds, which is a play that featured Socrates. So he's a little sensitive about these things. It's not that the rhetoricians are necessarily bad guys, but the problem was they had pretensions of being able to do things that they probably couldn't do. So a lot of the rhetorical dialogues are using rhetoric as a jumping off point to talk about something else. So in this case, a lot of what he's talking about is justice and injustice, sort of like he does in the Republic. And he does this by talking to a famous rhetorician. His name is Gorgias, and his student Polus. And when that conversation kind of goes south, another guy comes in named Callicles, and he tries to make up for the slack that the other two were leaving, and they were leaving that slack because they were afraid to say the hard things. They were afraid to be kind of look bad to people. The words that they were saying, they wanted to look good to anyone else who might have been listening, and Callicles kind of doesn't care about that.
Right.
So the whole dialogue kind of spans this idea of what is the capability of rhetoric, mostly regarding teaching justice. Can it do that? And then what is rhetoric? What is it capable of? And is it really this awesome thing that people are saying it is? And then finally, talking about justice in injustice in the context of pleasure and hedonism.
Yes, and I noticed as you mentioned the way that the different men that Socrates speaks with, he speaks with them very differently. Um, with Gorgias and Polus, it it seems like he's kind of talking circles around them, like they have something that they're not saying. But then Callicles, when he comes in, is very straightforward, and it seems like his argument is really a very selfish one in which he feels that the people who have special abilities or special positions of power or have the capabilities of doing so should try and give themselves as good of a life as possible. And there's definitely been, I feel like, across dialogues and a lot of Greek philosophy, the question of what is the good life. And what is Socrates's idea of the good life or a life well lived or a just life?
I think that if you had to really put it um, succinctly, it would be a life that's aligned with the form of the good. Now that sort of becomes a difficult one to unpack, but I think that if you take if you take the forms and kind of break them up into their little pieces, a lot of it has to do with virtue. A lot of the dialogues are revolving around virtues like justice and temperance and courage and that sort of thing. And um, and so I think that that's a really good uh, foundation for his belief on how to live well. And he's consistent. Even here in the Gorgias, he's saying that it's better to live according to justice than it is to commit injustice. It's better to suffer for the consequences of your evil actions than it is to commit evil actions. Elsewhere in the Republic, he says basically it's better to be just and basically get executed. Live a life of pain and suffering and then die than it is not to be just. So we have to sort of take him seriously there, but that's sort of the point of dissonance in this dialogue, where people are like, wait, I can't get behind that. I don't really want to be in pain. I don't really want to suffer. And justice doesn't seem like something that's going to really make it up to me
Mhm.
in that sense. So that's kind of where people are losing him
And
there.
it seems to almost foreshadow the end of Socrates' life when he is, uh, you know, at first attempted to be exiled, but then executed by the state, by the same people that he tried to teach. So there's definitely some foresight there, or perhaps hindsight, since it is Plato writing this down afterwards. But you definitely see the context of this greater life. And when you speak of the form of the good, my understanding of the forms is that if you look at something that is good and something else that is good and find what it is that they're both pointing to, what it is that they're both sharing, you'll be able to understand a little bit about goodness. And so
Yeah.
for Socrates, he's more concerned with aligning his life to the idea of goodness, the form, as Plato's words would put it, of goodness. Whereas it seems like, especially to Callicles, or maybe just Callicles is especially willing to be transparent about it, he's much more concerned with the benefits of life, the worldly pleasures.
Yeah, he sort of represents he probably represents the Greek worldview as it came down from Homer. The hero that's gonna do what he's gonna do, and he's gonna be the boss, and he's gonna kill a lot of people, and he's gonna get all the women, and he's gonna defy the gods and all that stuff. So I think that he sort of represents what everyone is thinking, and no one really wants to
Hmm.
say. Um, which is I want the best possible life for myself, and I don't really care how I'm gonna get it. And there's some elements of the social contract in there where people, this is more coming from the Republic, but I think that it crosses over where people are like, well, I can't really do that without getting arrested or beat up or murdered or something else. So I'm just going to kind of do as much bad as I can without getting in trouble. And then, let the chips fall where they may. But it's this attitude of finding value in particularly money, fame, and power are the three big Greek ones, and pleasure we see with Callicles. um, it's those sorts of things that Socrates is fighting against here and elsewhere.
Right. So Socrates, even though today we think of him as the ultimate Greek philosopher, the representative of everything that came from his students, Plato and Aristotle, and their students, and so on, to form classical Greek culture, he was very much different from most of the people of his time.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can even kind of look at the stuff that kind of shot out from Socrates. Obviously, you have Platonism and by extension Aristotelianism, but the Stoics, the Cynics, the Skeptics, these are all schools that the Hellenistic schools really shot out from Socrates for different reasons. So, if you're familiar with Diogenes the Cynic, um, he's a really interesting character in philosophy, but he really has his roots in Socrates and the way that Socrates lived his life. Very opposed to, not opposed to pleasure, but just opposed to a needless pleasure or excess
Mhm.
pleasure. He did things that were really strange. Like if you read in the Symposium, he'd walk around barefoot, and he'd kind of like get really close to potential lovers and never do anything with them. He would not eat for days on end and march for a long time, and he just kind of do these things that you'd say that's uncomfortable. I don't really want to do that. Um, so he represents a lot of different ideas that sort of fractalized, like a prism, and turned into all these different schools, and ultimately affected the West in immense ways.
It's interesting that you mentioned the way that there were so many branches off from Socrates. And going down the chain of students, I mean, we even get to some very influential people, Socrates to Plato to Aristotle to Alexander the Great, and
Yeah,
so this very relatively lowly in terms of someone who's not trying to be one of the great heroes like the Bronze Age men of the Trojan War, these warriors looking for glory. That's not Socrates at all. Yet his ideas influence the. I mean, even the men who would come to rule most of the known world at his time. Um,
yeah,
and even though he wasn't involved in any type of rule or leadership, Socrates mentions justice quite a bit. And what exactly does he think about it, and what are his ideas of living a just life, whether that's for an individual, for a ruler, for a society?
so in the Republic, he goes through this, and there's a lot of questions as to where he actually lands. But basically, his idea of justice is doing your part, functioning within society in a way that you ought to. And there's some wiggle room there, but basically, work, don't hurt other people, um, and do your part, right? I'm not sure if we're supposed to necessarily import that into this dialogue, because this dialogue, I think the idea of justice is sort of it's assumed that it just basically means like don't do bad things, like don't break the law. A lot of it has to do with law because we're talking about rulers, and we're talking about um, what people can get away with and what they should expect from the punitive side of justice. So when we're talking in that sense, I think we should just kind of take it at face value to say living in alignment with the norms of society, not trying to get ahead in any ways that are illicit or illegal.
Mhm. So even if it's not necessarily the norms of that culture of the time that Socrates had, well, that had been the norms before him, or that these people like Gorgias, Polus, and Callicles are representing, it seems like he's much more comfortable with the idea of suffering and comfortable with the idea of and encouraging of the idea of suffering for what's right being something that is good, that it is better to live a good and just and moral life than to have any of the worldly pleasures. I mean, if we think of, like, when I think of someone who is the opposite of what Socrates is going for in this, I think of someone who actually knew Socrates quite well, was a student of Socrates, Alcibiades, who had very much lived this, I suppose, hedonistic kind of lifestyle, famous trader in it for himself, and is very much portrayed like that, at least by people in the future writing about him as well, where Socrates is portrayed very differently, is concerned with something far above this world.
Yeah, I think that one of the important elements of Socrates' argument, and it's hard because this kind of gets conflated with other dialogues, and it also gets conflated with a lot that comes afterwards in Neoplatonism and with Christianity. But I think that there's a kernel of something in Socrates in this dialogue that is saying that you being good, like yourself being good, is actually more important than you feeling good. And in some sense, he uses the myth at the end to kind of justify this, but I don't think he necessarily would strictly justify it with the myth. In fact, I've heard a lot of people very disappointed with the myth. They say, well, you're making this argument for justice, and then you're just saying, well, at the end, you're just going to go to hell or whatever. It's no big deal. Like people are waiting for him to kind of explain why this is the case in this life. And I think that there's something there. And what I think it is that when you are good, you are actually aligning yourself with this this metaphysical cosmological good that existed before you, will exist after you, and you being a part of that is sort of your soul doing what it's supposed to do. So you'll be sort of miserable if you do anything else. You might have bodily pleasure, you might have comforts, but your soul is corrupt. And because of that, your spectrum of happiness has gotten a lot smaller.
Mm. And I I find it very interesting as you bring up the myth at the end of the dialogue, that it is very much this like Last Judgment type of scenario. But I think it comes into something much deeper than just saying, "Well, be good, or you're going to go to the bad fiery place where the red guy's going to poke you with a stick forever." Right? Um, I think that Socrates really focuses on not the worldly benefits that one can gain in the world, but looking at the overall picture of someone's, in the words he would use, someone's soul. But I think we can see that even in the way we think of looking back in history, right? If we look at the Homeric idea of greatness. We're looking at people, these fierce warriors like Achilles, or these tricksters like Odysseus, um, and they are fascinating characters with their own journeys that I find really inspiring in many ways. But if we want to look at somebody closer to our modern times who's like one of them, I mean, we could maybe look at somebody like Napoleon. The idea of
Hmm.
a warrior, a general who was exiled from his own land and was able to speak so well, he roused his own troops to turn against the state which had exiled him to try to make one last great fight. And yet look at how our contemporary society 200 years later looks at Napoleon.
Yeah,
We
right.
think of a short, though he wasn't actually, but an angry man trying to overcompensate and make himself a ruler of the world, very much going for those worldly pleasures, and yet we can. And I wonder if, speaking as an American, there's something about it in that we're very democratized of things, very much maybe different from, but in the tradition of Athens, right? Um, the idea of stripping back the ideas of power, the ideas of being this European emperor in Napoleon's case, and looking at the character of a person and the way that historical hindsight can judge someone. Um,
Hmm.
in this myth, it talks about the idea of the Last Judgment, where you're either going to the Isles of the Blessed, which is like the Elysian Fields, this paradise afterlife, or Tartarus, which is a very torturous afterlife. When you look in mythology at people like Sisyphus, Tantalus, these people who've had these great punishments. That's Tartarus. When when we think of Hades or hell in our contemporary context, that's more along the lines of what we're thinking of. Whereas Hades, in the classical sense, was kind of more of an underworld, kind of a gloomy place where everyone's hanging out and just kind of bummed to not be alive anymore, but it is what it is. When we look at something like in the Odyssey, when Odysseus journeys to
Yeah.
the underworld, right? Um, but in this dialogue, in this myth, with that last judgment, there is a problem, and the problem is that people are judged before they're going to die. It's, hey, you're going to die tomorrow, so you're going to go before these judges who are children of Zeus and some of the earliest cycle of Greek myths. And so take some time, make your case, and, put on a sob story if you want, start crying, make yourself try and look good. And it leads to a lot of people being sent in the wrong places.
Mhm.
Um, the text here says that accordingly, Pluto, being Hades, of course, and the stewards from the Isles of the Blessed came and told Zeus that the wrong people were going to both places. Then Zeus said, well, I will put a stop to that. Cases are judged badly now, said he, because those who are tried come to judgment with their clothes on, for they are still alive when judged. And therefore many, said he, who possessed evil souls are invested with fine bodies and lineage and wealth. When the trial takes place, many witnesses come forward to testify that they've lived righteous lives. So the judges are dazzled by these, and at the same time they are clothed themselves when they give sentence. Their eyes, their ears, and their whole bodies acting as a screen before their souls. They have all these hindrances before them, both their own clothing and that of those on trial. The idea of clothing we can think of in a mythological symbolic language as the externalities. To think of clothing, it is the garments of an emperor and all of the people that a king or a rich man can bring to testify for him, and all of these externalities that he can show to try and show what a great person he was. And at the same time, the judges are clothed as well. They have these biases of their role, being children of a god in Zeus's case, uh, that nothing is being judged right. We're being distracted by the outward images and not seeing the true person. So the solution here is separating the soul and the body. And Socrates in the myth mentions how the body after death shows the scars and the signs of the way life was lived. He says, if you were a fat man in life, you're going to have a fat corpse. If you broke your arm, you're going to be able to tell. How many times have we found a caveman and been able to tell what their diet and their life was like? I mean, I'm pretty sure we've found a fossil of a Tyrannosaurus Rex and been able to tell that it had gout. Um, the the body can tell you a lot about the person, even though we don't know anything about the life that they lived. We don't know if that caveman with their diet was a a good person or not, but we can tell some things by the body that is left behind. And the judgment here, the way that Socrates seems to be through this myth asking us to judge others is through their soul, getting rid of the externalities, the clothing, and showing that the same things are going to be evident in death. He says, and so I believe the same thing is true of the soul, Callicles. Once it has been stripped of the body, everything in the soul is manifest. Its natural characteristics and the experiences which a man's soul has encountered through occupations of various kinds. And so, if you are stripped of the outward signs of worldly success, you can look at the soul to see the real person there. And the idea is that as these naked souls are brought before the judges, then they can see the twistings and the breakings of a person who has lived an unjust life and are totally unaware and have no way to know whether that was a common thief or some great king or some great ruler. And I find it very interesting because Socrates definitely places a far greater responsibility on the rulers, on the people in power, than he does on the commoners. And I'm wondering if that's something you found Plato does throughout his dialogues, or is this one unique in that way, in that sense?
I don't think so. I can't put my finger on it exactly, but I know that there are a couple of dialogues where the same sort of situation comes up where someone says, "Hey, look at this guy. He must have been really happy." I think it was Archelaus in this particular dialogue, and they kind of go through his life and realize that yes, while he was successful and got whatever he wanted, he did so in such a disgusting way, killing people and doing all these illicit things to get his power. So I think that that's probably true across the line. I think what he ends up doing most of the time, though, is using these high profile individuals just because they're a good reference point. Like everyone
Mm,
knows, uh, you know, um, everyone knows Pericles, everyone knows Archelaus, everyone knows all these people that get referenced. Um, so I think that there is some sense that the more vice you commit, the more injustice, the kind of the more you're going to be in for it. And
mm.
because the stakes are so much higher, just kind of like amplifying your influence, these people just have more possibility of doing wrong and doing bad things to people.
Right. I've definitely questioned quite a few times in terms of and it can be applied to any type of institution where there's a lot of power. The question of, is it power that corrupts people, or is it that narcissistic people are attracted to
Mm.
positions of power, right? I definitely think that Socrates mentions this idea of power enabling evil. Um, and he does it actually through the Homeric tradition, saying that Homer bears him out on this as those who suffer eternal punishment in Hades are kings or princes. And a lot of the people who meet these great punishments that we can see in, like, Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example, are powerful people. And Socrates mentions someone as a foil to this, Thersites. He says, Thersites or any other private person who did wrong has by no one been represented as afflicted with cruel punishment, because incurable. For I suppose he had not the power, and therefore was happier than those who had. Um, Thersites, who's mentioned here, he is in the Iliad, kind of plays the role of the common soldier, and we know that because when we're told of Thersites, he's not Thersites, son of this person. He's not Thersites of this line. He's not Thersites who was trained in the warrior tradition by this he's just Thersites. He is very interesting because he speaks out of turn. He doesn't hold the scepter when he is attacking Agamemnon and some of these leaders. He is trying to say, listen, you all, why are you upset? You guys get everything. You are the rich men who are coming out of this Trojan War and sacking this city and going home rich and with tons of slaves, male and female, so to work for you and to tend to your house. And you are getting this ransom whenever you kidnap people. And look at us commoners. Um, we're not able to benefit from any of that. Yet we still suffer, we still fight. And it's interesting that Socrates mentions, yeah, Thersites isn't one of those people who ends up in one of these hellish eternal punishments. And there's a little bit of a question of, is that because he's better? Or is it because even common people who have flaws can rectify them and can make changes by looking at the examples of these terrible people in punishments? Um, and that brings it to the question of the afterlife in this myth, right? Here, it's very much a good place, bad place kind of duality one, but there's a different role that's sort of an in between. And in many ways, I feel like it mirrors or foreshadows or speaks to something that is also spoken to by the later tradition, Neoplatonism and Christianity, as these ideas came in. Even looking at something like the Divine Comedy,
Hmm.
Socrates mentions the idea of there being people who are going to be punished forever, and there's just no hope for them. And they're never going to change. They are set in their ways. You could think of somebody in Dante's Inferno, where they are in this great punishment and still just upset and bickering about how, my life, this is so unfair, or I'm so bitter still, and I was right, and I wouldn't do a thing differently if I went back. And then there are people who can either suffer and be made better for it, or people who are able to learn from the lesson of the suffering of others. Um, this idea that if you're hearing this, it's not too late.
Yeah, right. There's actually I mean, there's a couple of important physical parallels to this in the earlier parts of the dialogue. Because remember, Socrates is suggesting for people who are evil, people who have done, well, maybe people aren't evil, people who have done evil, people who have been unjust. He says, go run to the judge, confess yourselves, and use rhetoric to, as effectively as possible, explain how bad you are. Don't leave anything out so that the judge can then go ahead and give you a punishment, and that punishment is actually good for you. It's actually doing something to your soul that's positive. So in a way that mirrors what you're talking about in this eternal realm or in this afterlife, where there's a sense in which there's got to be justice happening, and part of that justice is punishment. And ideally, if we're thinking about the divine, depending on how this is construed, there would be some element of restorative justice as well. Because I mean, we expect that here. Why not expect it there? But also, the another important parallel is that this dialogue, I mean, this myth is actually brought into play because Socrates is being accused of being unable to defend himself in a court of law, because Socrates is not, he's not a well adapted rhetorician. He's not going to lie to make his case. We see in the Apology kind of how he rolls in that way, and so Callicles says, Socrates, you're gonna get beat up in the law courts. They're gonna make fun of you. They're gonna slap you around, and then you're gonna get a bad outcome. And so he uses this myth to kind of turn that on its head and say, well, actually, it's the unjust person that's going to get the bad outcome. So we have to, I think, to see the parallels between this life and the afterlife, help us to understand sort of what we ought to expect um, when it all kind of pans out.
And it's interesting too, because there are definitely differing ideas of the afterlife in ancient Greece. I mean, there is we can have in this one where there's sort of an eternal good place, bad place sort of divide. But then we have something like the myth of where there's more of um, a reincarnation, right? And then others, I mean, there were mystery cults and mystery rituals that we still know very little about, like the Eleusinian mysteries, where there was this, depending on how right we are with what we know, it seems like something of a psychedelic ritual that would show the rebirth through the story of Hades and Persephone and Demeter. Um, and then other ideas of immortality of fame, where think of how you're going to be remembered. Think of how, if people are still speaking of you all these years, centuries, millennia in this case later, you are still immortal, and your name, as long as your name is spoken, you haven't ever truly died. There are all these competing ideas, yet in many ways, I feel that they can be seen as somewhat harmonious, even if different, when you look at the good and the bad in each, right? If you're going to take the Platonic uh, prescription here to find like the form of the the good through this, that we can, whether you're going to be reincarnated and need to learn about, right, make a better life through that redemptive suffering, or whether it is seeing the punishments of others as, I mean, even we see here in the mythological tradition, there are these punishments of people um, who have been the worst, and it's the reason they're told is don't be like them. Uh, or if we're looking at, even as we were saying with the historical sort of view earlier, like we aren't reading this dialogue to get to learn more about Callicles. For something called the Gorgias, we're not we're not saying what does Gorgias think about all of this? And it's almost self-proving, self-fulfilling that it is Socrates that we are sent away wondering more about, wanting to hear more from. And it's from Socrates that we have this idea of, listen, there is something beyond this life that you're focused on, and myth is one way to communicate it, but there are all of these different ways to show, go for a just life, go for something righteous. If you're listening, it's not too late. So let us follow this, I say, inviting others to join us, not that which you believe in and commend to me, for it is worthless, dear Callicles. The idea of finding that good, being convinced by one of these stories, whether it's of a literal judgment or not, that there's something more. And you're going, what, even if that something more is just history, that there's still a point to following this just life and to trying to die as good a man as you possibly can be. And that is Socrates' fate. He is sentenced to death, right? Exile, which he declines, and therefore death. And yet it's Socrates that we're talking about before anyone else now. It's Socrates, and through Plato, through Neoplatonism, through the meshing with Christianity, which, I mean, we can see through this afterlife idea, there was kind of the foundations there ready for uh ready to blend, as though the cultures were just waiting for each other in a way. It seems to give a very good prescription for what one ought to do for this idea of the good life.
Yeah, I think that, you know, regardless of what you believe, I think that you can learn from Callicles it's a bad idea to write it off, right? Like a lot of people, like I'm sure there's nothing gonna. I'm gonna die and it's gonna be nothing. Like that's probably a bad position for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously, like you were saying, there's definitely an element of teleology in life where we're gonna want to look at our end, look at where we're going, and use our lives to kind of work in that direction. And I think that having that is just helpful no matter what. But also, I mean, you could probably testify to this. Like this is a common theme. Like people have been about this idea for a long time. It would probably be a
Mhm.
bad idea just to write it off, um, offhand, just for that. You don't want to you don't want to take risks in that sense. I think.
And it's so interesting because it seems like there's a misconception of some skepticism about the role of the myth within the dialogue. I mean, as I was reading through various academic papers on this, I found one that was arguing that, oh, well, we shouldn't take anything Socrates says seriously, and he's joking with all this. But I feel like if we look at his own words, I mean, it starts with him saying, take everything I'm about to tell you as though it were absolute truth.
Yeah.
He's not necessarily saying, this is the absolute truth. I've been to the afterlife. But he's saying, for the good of your soul, take this as absolute truth. And when he is finishing his myth and going to a call of action, he says, okay, you don't like it. I get that. Find me something
Yeah.
better. Find me something more useful than this idea. Find me something that will lead you to live a better life. Because whether we're put on trial by these judges who are children of the gods to judge the state of our soul, like we're all being put on trial, uh, whether it's by ourselves or the memory of history, or if it is something of a metaphysical judgment. I think it appeals, and it speaks to the it speaks to the power of story and myth to communicate something that one might call truer than true, something that can show you the
Mm,
form. In
yeah.
a sense, it can give you a glimpse of something beyond the pleasures of this world. And I mean, I definitely think that that is a reminder that all of us can use, I mean, myself included, to think about what comes next in whatever way that may
Yeah, and
be.
I think that when you look at Socrates, he really kind of puts his money where his mouth is. If you look at the Phaedo, one of the earlier dialogues, which for Socrates scholars indicates that it probably has more Socrates than Plato in it.
Mhm.
When he's getting, and you could also look at the Apology and the Apology in Xenophon as well, which has some of those things included. But he's kind of about this afterlife. Like he believes that there will be some reconciliation, that there will be justice meted out to people, and that even when it doesn't, his expectation is that having lived in accordance with goodness and in accordance with the will of the gods, that he should expect something good. And he's telling people this. They're like, "Why aren't you afraid to die?" And that's one of his reasons. And I think that would lend me to believe that he's in earnest here, in the Gorgias, because he seems to put his own, he stakes his own life on that idea.
Right. He trusts in his personal spirit, right? His personal daimon that speaks to him and inspires him and tells him what is right. And I believe it's in the Apology that he says, listen, either the gods are just and I'm going to have a good life, or they're not just. So in that case, why should I care? there's I definitely agree that Socrates seems very earnest here, very much believes in the value of what he has to say, and that his death, his willing death, being put to execution by others, which, I mean, again, very much parallels the Christian idea, which I don't think it's a coincidence that Greece was the door or window through which Christianity entered Europe, uh, because of the openness to this idea of redemptive suffering, but also this idea of being willing to put one's life on the line for something higher, for a virtue. Um, Socrates willingly drank from the hemlock and was willing to face death. And when I think of, to bring it to Napoleon again, right? He's someone who was facing this exile, decided, no, I'm going to make a glorious last stand. And my goodness, it was a last stand. I mean, we are going to be talking about Waterloo for a very long time, too. But, well, I suppose the jury's out. And until we see exactly how literally true this myth may be, I'll let you know in 100 years at most. I'll talk to you then if I can. There's certainly history being the judge and society being the judge, culture being the judge, and ourselves being a judge too. So, any closing things you wanted to hit on for this dialogue? If not, what is next? What are you working on with 60-second philosophy, Matt, as we approach 60-minute philosophy on this one?
Yeah. Well, YouTube's had to take a little bit of a backseat. I'm actually working on a novel. I'm finishing that up here. Hopefully this winter. My work is seasonal, so I go back to work in April ish,
Mhm.
and so that's been my big thing. But trying to make some kind of what's the word? Trying to get some systems in order to be able to put some stuff out more regularly, but we'll see if that happens.
Hey, that is super exciting, and that is what splitting up large podcasts into small
Yeah.
clips is for. So, in that case, all that's left on my part, Matt, is I would like to thank you very much for this time. It has been really great going through this with you, and there are quite a few other dialogues. I mentioned the myth of Ur and the Republic before that I would love to hear your thoughts on and love to chat on again like this because this was a really great time. Um, and I thank you very much for that. And I'm really looking forward to everything that you are doing in the future. Uh, Looking forward to hearing more about the novel as that all comes through it as well. And whatever else this may hold. This has been a great conversation. I'm
Yeah,
looking forward
great.
to many more.
Perfect. Let's do it again.